Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him, how I've proved him o'er and o'er. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more. Trusting Jesus. Psalm 112 talks about trusting Jesus. It says, starting in verse 6, "For the righteous will never be moved, for he will be remembered forever. He is not afraid of bad news. His heart is firm, trusting in the Lord. His heart is steady, he will not be afraid." Psalm 112:7 says that the one that is righteous is not afraid of bad news. Now we've all heard the saying that no news is good news, right? And today there's plenty of news these days, right? Plenty of news, which means that there's plenty of bad news. And my question for all of us is, how are we going to deal with that? What are you going to do with the news you're hearing these days? I just want to look at a few examples in Scripture as to how some godly men dealt with news, with bad news that they received. King David in 1 Samuel 30. Starting in verses 3 and 4. King David and his men had been off and they just had a great victory in battle. They came back and it says, when David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. And to add insult to the injury, his men were so upset they wanted to stone David. But what did David do? It says that David found strength, or he strengthened himself in the Lord his God. He strengthened himself. Another example is Job. We're all probably familiar with Job and how he got bad news, one wave of bad news after another. His animals were killed along with his farm hands. And then while that messenger was telling him that, another messenger shows up and tells him about his sheep and his shepherds had been burned up. And even while that guy was speaking, another one shows up and tells him that his camels and servants were stolen and killed. And then yet another messenger shows up. If all of this is not enough, he gets news that a wind swept through a house that collapsed on all his sons and daughters and took them all, killed all of his children. How would you handle news like that? Just think about it. What would you do? You know what Job did? It says in this, in the very beginning of Job, it says, "Then he fell to the ground in worship, and he said, 'Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord took away. May the name of the Lord be praised.'" In all of this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. He praised God. And then a third guy I want to look at is Nehemiah. Nehemiah was another one who got bad news. He sent off a report of how Jerusalem was doing, and the report came back like this. It says, "Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." And that really upset Nehemiah. And here's how he responded in verse 4. He says, "When I heard these things, I sat down and I wept. For some days I mourned and I fasted and I prayed before the God of heaven. And then I said, 'Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to the prayer of your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you.'" And so he goes on to just confess sin. He goes on and reminds the Lord in verse 8. He says, "Remember the instruction you gave to your servant Moses, saying, 'If you're unfaithful, I'll scatter you. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling place for my name.'" And so there are many things here that Nehemiah does. He reminds God of his promises. That's okay to do. It's okay to remind God. God remembers. But it's really about reminding us of God's promises and who he is. Nehemiah wept and mourned and fasted and prayed. And then Job, he fell to the ground in worship. David strengthened himself in the Lord. So there's going to be a lot of news these days. If you watch the news today, I promise you that there will be more bad news. But here's the good news, and we have to remind ourselves of this daily. God's got this. God's got this. I just want to read a few verses before closing here. Psalm 9:10 says, "And those who know your name put their trust in you. For you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you." Psalm 28:7, just listen to this. "The Lord is my strength and my shield. In him my heart trusts, and I am helped. My heart exults, and with my song I give thanks to him." Isaiah 26:3 says, "You keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you." Why? Because he trusts in you. That's how the Lord keeps us at peace, is that we keep our minds fixed on him and we trust him. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust him. How I've proved him over and over and over. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus. Oh, for grace to trust him more. That's my prayer for all of us today, that as we hear news of what's going on in the world, that we grow in our trust of God today. He's got this. God bless you. I'm praying for you, church family.